Yeah, I'm going to be the one introducing the session. I'm Jill Rivard with Hiawatha Valley Adult Education. The session is titled, Yes, You Can Fund Your Adult Career Pathway. And our objective is really for participants to be able to identify various funding options for supporting adult career pathway programming. We'll have three different presenters today: Julie Dincau with MDE, Nadine with Hiawatha Hawthorne in Rochester, and then Karen with Mankato ABE. If you have any technical issues, you can privately chat Patsy Egan, and she can help you get through that. You should be hearing us at this time. And we'd ask that while you wait, you could chat with us different funding options, and a couple people have done that. It looks like transitions funding. I know we use that to offer some career pathway classes, so that comes in very handy. And then Meg had talked about also working with the partnerships with workforce. So is Julie ready to go with her session?
Hi, Jill. Yes, I am. So thank you. We can move to the next slide. All right. And so before we look at current adult career pathway funding, I think it's important to understand kind of how we arrived here. If you have been in adult basic education for a while, you'll remember that around 2005, there was a push to move ABE learners beyond the GED, so beyond a high school completion and into training, post-secondary or employment. Those were the three options. And this push came from research that showed that ABE learners' outcomes were closer to those of a student who had dropped out of high school than to a student who had received a high school diploma. So that and other research around that was kind of the impetus to make some changes in the adult basic education system. So there were a variety of reasons as to why their outcomes were closer to those of students who had dropped out of high school than to those who had graduated. And part of it was they didn't have a clear pathway forward. They didn't have a clear next step defined for them. And they didn't have support that not only helped support them get to that next step, but helped them persist along the way in that next step. So they needed ongoing support. And then probably the biggest rationale is they needed more funding to support themselves and their families. I remember I made the mistake of thinking that if they could just get the financial aid to pay for the college classes, they'd be good. And by no means does that cover the needs that adult basic learners have. So many of these needs then were built into a new model, the career pathway model, to ensure that learners can then stay on a pathway. And so the adult career pathway model is a relatively new model that started around 2005, or we started experimenting with it. And so from 2008 to 2014, there was at least $10 million that was brought into Minnesota alone in funding. And this funding came from the Joyce Foundation, which created the shifting gears, or the fast-tracked funding. We had WIA incentive grants that Minnesota, it was kind of a competition across all 50 states to see which ABE programs and their workforce partners could meet these set goals. And Minnesota only missed that goal once, and it was due to adult basic education's not meeting our targets. So after that, we made sure we did, and that brought in a lot of incentive funding that funded a lot of pilots. And then we also had ARA, which is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, during the recession that we had. And that funding was also put into piloting, experimenting, planning, and programming around adult career pathways. And so nationally, several foundations did the research on best practices around career pathways. So it was CLASP, it was the National Governors Association, Lumina. All of the big foundations were kind of pushing the adult career pathway model forward. And in 2014, when the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act passed, now that replaced the Workforce Investment Act, we finally had a definition of an adult career pathway written into law. That is a huge step, and it has a big implication to the adult basic education system. Next slide, please. So after 2014, it is determined through our federal office that adult basic education is no longer just reading, math, basic skills. It's also transitioning adults to education, post-secondary, or employment. And it clearly recognizes that the completion of high school is not an end in itself, but a means to further economic self-sufficiency. But we also realize that we need to support these individuals in attaining their next step. Next slide, please. So if there's one takeaway I want you to take away from this session is that adult basic education funding can support training in an integrated education and training program. Traditionally, we have said, no, you cannot spend this funding to pay for the training piece. That changed under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Now, the condition is that you have to try to leverage all your other funding resources available before you can spend your ABE funding on the training component. And we'll go a little bit into that with the two presenters who will show you how they are doing a great job leveraging other resources. The other piece is that the Integrated English Literacy and Civics Education Grant now requires an IET component, meaning that there has to be a training component on that. And then, as I mentioned, the adult career pathway has been defined and is put into law, or the definition of it is defined. Next slide, please. So where are we in 2020? We have state funding other than adult basic education formula funding known as Pathways to Prosperity. So 1.5 million of ongoing state funding was dedicated to Minnesota Fast Track. That's also in statute or rule. And that funding was rolled into Pathways to Prosperity. Traditionally, every 2 years, an ABE program can apply for a Pathways to Prosperity grant, and adult basic education is a required component of that grant. So every grant that goes out is supposed to have an adult basic education partner involved in that grant. I asked where we currently are at with the Pathways to Prosperity grants, and there were, due to COVID, there were some grantees who were not able to continue their training because it required a lot of hands-on training. So they have declined some portions of their grant because they can't offer it. And the Adult Career Pathway Office at DEED will be pooling those funds and redistributing those funds to current P2P grantees through an RFP process. So if you currently hold one of those grants and you're able to make it work through virtual training or other means, you might be on the lookout for when those additional funds will be available. For those of you who are interested in the next round of P2P grants, those will be available this summer, more likely than not, if the legislature approves that. And I see this as going two ways. With the COVID impacts, it could mean a decrease in the funding. However, with the number of people who need additional training and to reskill, it could see an increase in funding. So at this point, we really don't know if the funding is going to be available and how much funding will be available. Next slide, please. So your most reliable sources of adult career funding are the AFLA funding. That's the Adult Education Family Literacy Act funding. And that goes through transitions, regional transitions aid. And so the whole idea around creating regions was to support kind of adult career pathways. It was transitions to your post-secondary institutions, mainly the Minnesota State two-year community colleges, transitions or working with your career force partners, and then with employers in the area as well. And now would be an excellent time to leverage that funding. We realize that it's not possible for all ABE programs across the state to offer an adult career pathway in certified nurses training, in welding, commercial driver's license, etc. So this regional pot of funding can be used to develop regional pathways. So that is really one area to leverage if you want to work on like doing this virtually or through distance learning. In addition, the Integrated English Literacy and Civics Education Grant is available to programs that serve English language learners. You'll be able to apply for that grant in spring of 2022. It seems far off now, but it really isn't as far as planning, because this is a 3-year grant and you can apply to up to $100,000 per year. So total that would bring $300,000 into a consortium, but it just doesn't have to be a consortium. It could be several sites pooling together to apply. There are many different ways that you could apply to this type of funding. And because this grant requires an integrated education and training component, it's ideal for establishing adult career pathways. And I mentioned the Pathways to Prosperity grants already, and the best way, again, to leverage those is not to go it alone as an adult basic education program. However, you can, if you find your partners aren't working with you, you can do that, but try to do it in partnership with a local board and have them do the grant writing and building in the pieces, because it is it's intensive to submit for that grant. And you also have to add your data into Workforce One, which is something that your career force or workforce partners already know how to do. All right, and the third reliable source is the DEED Low Income Worker Training Program. This is one that has not been leveraged by adult basic education, but it's for individuals who are 200% below the poverty level, and that is a large proportion of adult basic education learners in Minnesota. Unfortunately, the deadline for this just passed. It was September 14th, and it's not necessarily promoted to the adult basic education field. It's considered more of an employer Minnesota state funding opportunity, but this particular piece, it's part of the Minnesota Job Skills Partnership grants. They have 3 grants. This particular one would fit very well with adult basic education. And I have asked them to provide us with better notice of when these become available. And they typically only become available when they have additional funding. So next slide, please. Oops. Well, I just wanted to make, if you could go back a minute. So ideally, a program would not have to rely on grants to offer adult career pathways. The idea is to align resources. Oftentimes, you'll hear braided funding as the term people like to use to support learners in adult career pathways. There's 2 things programs should be doing at a minimum to ensure that learners are accessing the funding resources that are available to them. One thing is to co-enroll all adult career pathway learners into other Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act programs. Chances are, more likely than not, they are eligible for youth funding, dislocated worker funding, and adult funding through the your workforce center or career force center. That's going to help pay for transportation, childcare. It also pays for training. It pays for them to go to training. And I think they can get up to $5,000 to support training. If it's the dislocated worker grant, they can actually get a Bachelor of Arts, go all the way through a BA, and it will pay for that. So become familiar with these different funding streams and who to contact at your local career force center so that a learner can access that. But I'll also say that Nadine and Karen have done some innovative stuff about inviting that person to their site and enrolling them. So I'm excited to hear what they have to say. So that's one thing, make sure your learners are co-enrolled. And the other one is have them complete the FAFSA form. Help them complete the FAFSA form to see if they qualify for federal financial aid. Again, those are just 2 resources, and Patsy has put in a link for adult career pathway funding sources, a grid that I started, and it's a workbook. And there is a worksheet with federal opportunities for funding, state opportunities for funding, other grants that support what we do that can be the Otto Bremer grant. I think there's a Great Lakes Foundation, Dollar Literacy, other grants like that. And then finally, resources or grant funding that supports provides support for support services for the learners in the programs, which kind of relates to navigation services, which is the hardest piece out of all the components of an adult career pathway to fund, is the navigation. So with that, I would like to turn it either back to Jill to introduce our presenters, or go directly. Well, I'll give it to you, Jill.
Okay, thank you, Julie. And just remember to, if you have any questions, just to chat them in and we will cover them as we go. Our next speaker is Nadine, and she is from Hawthorne, ABE in Rochester. Going to talk about her Bridges to Careers pathway.
Sure, next slide. So as Julie was saying, and Karen and I both, you have to get very creative with your funding, and we do rely fairly heavily on grants to do this work. We haven't had to use our state or federal funding as of now, but as grants, and that would be an option that we would look at. So we have two major pathways that I'll kind of go through and talk to you about what we do for funding. We have our healthcare pathway. Our healthcare pathway, the on-ramp with the CNA prep piece of it starts at an ABE level 4. So we felt like there was many students who wanted this pathway, but their skills weren't there yet. So we created with some transition dollars a kind of pre-on-ramp class. So, and that's our health literacy class, where they, do some health careers exploration. They do some skill building. They work on their reading to get them to that ABE level 4 so they can start in the health care pathway. Our on-ramp programming for that pathway is we have our CNA prep class, which is funded through a Bremer grant, and that's in collaboration. And the career pathways class, our career pathways class is our employability class, where they do resumes and mock interviews and time management and all the employability skills that employers want. They're both funded right now through a Bremer grant, but that's a grant that we got in collaboration with Workforce. In those classes, the Workforce Navigator will come into the classes, and in those classes, they will do the paperwork to co-enroll them into other programs that Workforce can provide support for. They also work with employers to come in and do presentations to the class. They'll set up mock interviews for our students during class time. The employers will come in and do mock interviews. So they do all that in the beginning of that on-ramp class. They tour long-term care facilities, that type of thing. The navigator will set in collaboration with the teachers. They kind of work together to make those things happen. The bridge programming of that pathway is kind of the next step up. They've gotten their CNA certification and now they're maybe working. But then they want to come back and they want to wrap back around and they maybe want to go on to advanced hospital CNA so they can work at Mayo Clinic, or they want to go into the phlebotomy program at Mayo Clinic, or they are really interested in maybe becoming an LPN or a 2-year RN. And so our students, once they got their CNA certification, they came back and they said, I want more and you need to help us achieve more. And that's where we, again, kind of wrote some grants or whatever. And what are they having difficulty with out at our community college? So one of them is medical terminology and anatomy and physiology. So they need help with that. A difficult class is psychology sometimes for English language learners and others. And then we also have the CNA CPR certification piece of it. Once they get done with the prep class, then they go on to the certification. And then they will wrap back around after they get a job. They're all funded through different sources, as you can see. Bremer Grant has been very supportive of our Bridges to Healthcare programming. But we also went to the legislators and said, we have a model that's really working and it's moving people off of MFAB, it's moving off of public assistance, it's getting people employed and livable jobs. And so the legislators have given us a round of appropriations money, 2-year, this is our would be our 3rd year of appropriations dollars. So that's been very nice that they see the value of it and understand that it is worthwhile. We're coming up again for, that funding is coming to an end and we don't know if it will be renewed or not. So that's the piece that's always difficult with funding. You're always constantly looking for funding. From the bridge programming, they go to the integrated programming, and then they'll go on to they'll either go to RCTC, which is our community college, and they'll go on to advanced hospital CNA. There's appropriations money to help them with those scholarships with that. And there's also workforce funding resources. They also apply for in the class. There is a class that we have that they do their FAFSA with so that they can get financial aid also. And that class is a little, we have all of our students in all of our pathways that are going on to college are in what we call the D2L class, which I'll show you later. But in that class, they do their financial aid. And and then phlebotomy is also LPN, 2-year RN. Those are all funded through appropriations or through workforce funding that the student qualifies for. What you have to understand is that the workforce funding resources goes to the individual. It does not go to like the program. So it doesn't really, we haven't figured out yet maybe how that funding could go to support a teacher for some of these classes. But it goes with the individual. For, like Julie said, they can get help funding with school, they can get transportation, other barriers. But if that funding can help remove barriers for students, then that helps us too. Mayo Clinic has been an employer who has really come on board for this pathway, and they actually are funding $100,000, which is given to workforce development for a full-time navigator, and then whatever extra goes to scholarships. So next slide. So our other pathway is our administrative office professional or office support specialist. We have they're kind of together. So so the on-ramp for that is our North Star Digital class and our Career Pathways class. Those are both funded through P2P grant. We are the employer that kind of was most interested. We have interested in this pathway was Olmsted County. And also Mayo Clinic in Health Administrative Office Professional. So it also has, so we have 2 employers that work with us on this pathway. So when we meet with them, we say, what are the skills that you are looking for an employee? And so then they help us build the programming around these pathways. And if they help build the programming, they're more apt to contribute either with time and or money. So our bridge programming for that pathway, we have keyboarding class and the National Retail Customer Service Certification, which is all paid for through P2P grant. And then once they get done with the bridge program and they go out to Rochester Community and Technical College to either do the healthcare office professional or the administrative office professional. And those are funded through P2P grant, financial aid, or workforce funding resources. Next slide. And I don't see if there's any questions. I'm not, Jill, you'll chime in, won't you? Because, oh, that's right. We have a maintenance pathway. Sometimes I forget all our pathways. So our maintenance pathway is our newest pathway. So we've just started that, and it's been the most difficult pathway, but I think some of that is due to COVID and the problems around that, because this is also a very hands-on type of program that has been disrupted due to COVID. So that pathway also is funded almost all with P2P money because we wrote this into the P2P grant. So they have North Star Digital and Career Pathways. They move on to our community college to do OSHA 30 certification in the boiler special. And then if they choose to go on, they can go on to the facilities and service tech 2-year program at the community college, and the P2P grant would help with that. They also would do financial aid, and then they also would be eligible, if they're eligible, they can use workforce funding resources. So that we have a navigator that we wrote in for a half-time navigator through the P2P funding because we did have money in appropriations for the other half. So we have two full-time navigators in doing our pathways, helping with our pathways. Olmsted County does contribute to that also with monetary value besides just the, coming in and doing mock interviews and presentations. Where does the funding from Olmsted County come from? Is it a grant they received? No, it's not a grant, it's money they're allocating to us. I don't know 100% for sure, but we went and talked to their board and they're willing to fund us that amount. I guess maybe I should know more about that, but next slide. Additional career pathways and college classes that we offer we have articulated developmental classes here that we use appropriations money to work with students to skill students up so they don't have to use financial aid for those classes, but they get college credit for it. But we use appropriations money for that because we want them to have all their financial aid money, if possible, to use for their career and not have to use it for developmental classes. So we have English and reading classes. We actually have a co-taught English 11-17. That's the first semester English class, the gateway class as we call it. That is co-taught with our instructor. So the students who go to our 960 class, that same instructor will go out to RCTC with them and be there and co-teach that class. And then he offers what we call the writing lab, which is the kind of the wraparound support for that class. We also have a flex lab out there, and that's for all our the med term, the administrative office professional classes that they are doing out there. An AV instructor is available to help with those classes, and she has contact with the instructor. She's not co-teaching in the class, but they communicate back and forth on issues and problems and how to solve them. I use my state funding to do, well, I guess you would say the lower developmental class, which was really ABE classes, but to get them to that next level. And all of our math college prep classes are state funded. I don't know, do you have another slide? No. Okay, so I did talk a little about, we have, I guess I didn't put in here our D2L class. That's our class where our instructor and actually our college RCTC transition advisor will come in and help with that class. And in that class, they will do their financial aid, they will do their application forms. They can then make appointments with that RCTC transition advisor for some career counseling. So it just like the workforce navigators come into the class and do paperwork and they get to know them and provide resources. We also have a college transition advisor who comes into the classes and does paperwork, does counseling, and provides resources for them. Any questions for me or? All right.
Thank you, Nadine. Just remember to chat in any questions as we go. Any questions for Nadine, or we will move on to Karen. And Karen is the manager at Mankato ABE. You can go ahead, Karen.
Hi, everyone. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about the funding sources that we use for our adult career pathway programs. And the biggest funding source that we have right now is our Pathways to Prosperity funding. I need to also make a statement that we pretty much completely rely on grants for our adult career pathway programming. I have a robust ESL and GED program here in Mankato, and I pretty much use all of my state funds for that. So our adult career pathway and college prep funding has always been funded through grants. And we've been receiving grants for adult career pathway programming since the beginning of Fast Track, which dates back to, I believe, 2008. And we've been funded the whole time. Usually those are 2-year grants in most cases. So currently we have Pathways to Prosperity funding, and that funds our bridge and integrated programming on campus. That programming is in the areas of manufacturing and healthcare, and we're starting to expand to automotive, mechanics, auto body, and some construction, starting with HVAC. We haven't had a lot of participation in those yet, but our main ones that we've been doing for the last several years are manufacturing and healthcare. So all of the bridge and integrated programming is funded through P2P. We also, our support is funded. By that I mean our navigator. So we have a full navigator that's funded through DEED under that Pathways to Prosperity. And our Pathways to Prosperity funding is done in partnership with our local workforce development board and all the partners in our city. So we have a whole career pathways committee that works on that particular funding and the programming around it. And we've expanded in the last couple of years to that being regional. So Southwest and South Central, Southwest PIC and South Central Workforce Council work together to write Pathways to Prosperity grants. And then that money is used throughout the whole region. I believe it's more than 20 counties that are served by that funding. Locally, I tie my Pathways to Prosperity and leverage funding from other sources to make programming at Mankato happen. So one of the things we do is we partner with our local MFIP partner, Blue Earth County Employment Services, and they make a lot of referrals to Mankato ABE from Blue Earth County and mandate their students to come as part of their employment plan. They serve all the immigrants and refugees in the area. And so they actually fund a teacher, and that teacher teaches Onramp. So that Onramp teacher is funded half by P2P, a quarter by MFIP, and a quarter by me out of our state funds. And MFIP also funds a full-time paraprofessional in that course. So Onramp runs every day, Monday through Thursday, actually Monday through Friday, all morning. And we do career exploration in there. It's a very beginning of our ACP pathway. And we also do some basic certifications like ServSafe Food Handler and Manager, and we do Parapro. North Star Digital Literacy is done in there. So that partnership with Pathways to Prosperity kind of ended up joining in with our MFIP partnership, and we work on all of that together. A local consortium near us has also partnered in and has our teachers co-teaching Onramp now at this time. Let's see, so then part of that relationship with our MFIP partner allows us to have some support for the students that are MFIP students. And the support might be around helping them pay for a computer, helping them pay for their internet, funding some transportation for the MFIP students. And then we are able to use our state funds to pay for bus tokens and things like that for the other students that are not on MFIP. Another big piece of our funding puzzle is funding students' tuition and their support. And so when people are enrolled in our Adult Career Pathway program, we also want to co-enroll them in the WIOA programs. And that is done through Career Force in our area. Our navigator for P2P works at Career Force, so she's able to connect them to the right people or do it herself. And she will enroll youth up to age 24, co-enroll them in WIOA youth programming, or will enroll our adults in either adult, WIOA adult, or dislocated worker, depending on their situation. And once they're enrolled in that, then they can get tuition paid for through those WIOA programs, and we don't have to use our P2P grant to pay for tuition. So typically in Onramp and bridge classes, we're trying to figure out with our students which funding source is the best one for them. And if they don't qualify for the WIOA, then we will fund them through Pathways to Prosperity when it comes time to pay for tuition. In the bridge classes, we always connect them to the FAFSA, just like Julie had talked about and Nadine had talked about, and we help them with their FAFSA. So that's always done. Our regional transitions funds are a big part of our ACP programming. We have a really strong Southwest regional group that's meeting. And we meet every quarter, and we plan our transitions plan every year based on all of the different grants and work that we have going. And sometimes when you write grants, you don't always think about the details, like how are we going to write curriculum for this grant, or what kind of extra training might we need. You don't always know that ahead of time. So a lot of times our regional transitions is kind of a support piece to all of those different things that we're trying to accomplish. So what we've been doing with our transitions funding over the last couple of years is funding like startup classes with different consortia. And this year we stepped that up to turning those classes to online classes and training more people to teach them. So for example, our Para-Pro, which we've often run in Mankato under our Onramp. This last year we had a teacher from Hutchinson teach that. And then our teacher from Mankato joined her, and they learned from each other on teaching online, how to teach online. Child development is another one that we're starting up regionally this year. And that's not something we've been doing in Mankato, so we'll be able to benefit from learning that. Driving for ESL, a lot of students still need their driver's licenses before they can move up into any kind of career that might involve that, like a CDL, or if they want to drive for any other work, any other jobs that they're going to do, or if they are in auto mechanics or anything like that, they're going to have a driver's license. So we are going to be regionally offering a driving for ESL through our regional funds. And then a lot of curriculum development and sharing, all of the different pathways. Mankato always applies for an IELCE grant, which is the Integrated English Literacy and Civic Education grant. Typically, the very top levels of ESL that are going right into IET are kind of the target of what we're funding here. We also funded a liaison, which is kind of an ESL navigator to help us help people transition up into our on-ramp and bridge classes. I feel like we could never have enough liaisons, but we have very limited funding for that. So our liaison that works with the P2P is again at the DEED at the Career Force Center, coming to the ABE site. And she's able to work with the people who are enrolled in that grant. But there's people prior to that grant that still need navigation and help, and we're using our IELCE grant to pay for some of that liaison work. We also will fund certain things, like if we need extra materials for certain classes, we'll use regional funds and IELC funds to pay for some of that. Next slide. We also have some other funding coming in for what I would call more the developmental education realm at the college. This isn't directly in a career pathway. I mean, what I mean by that is it's not directly related to an industry, but it's necessary for people to move forward with their adult career pathway. And as you know, ABE funding, state funding is limited. You only have so much, and you can't just do everything. But I always want to do everything. So I work really closely with our college and with our workforce partners, because we're lucky enough to have two workforce centers and a college in our consortium boundaries. And so I really need to make sure that those things are ramped up and working, because the other ABE programs surrounding us will rely on that to help their students as well. So I wrote a grant to the Otto Bremer Foundation to create a developmental education partnership called Right Start. And this is different than the things we've done in the past. We've always had college prep, which is a preparation just generally for college, kind of like a bridge class, but not industry specific. Just working on preparation for college, college knowledge, AccuPlacer preparation. We've had that going since like 2007. with random funding sources. We've used Perkins for that. We've used, and I didn't even write that on here because we don't use it anymore, but we've used Perkins funding for that. The college has given us some funding for that. And we're at a point now where it feels like we need to work closer with the college on the developmental education. And they approached us and said, we really want you in the developmental courses with helping students get off to the right start. So we named it Right Start, and we have 5 classes on campus right now going, where we have our ABE teachers working directly with the college teachers doing integrated instruction, just like we do with the career side. It's bumpy. The road is very bumpy. It's not, for some reason, doesn't seem to be as easy as career pathways is, but we're doing it. So that programming is happening. That Otto Bremer grant, we're in the 2nd year of a 2-year grant. So I don't know after this what will happen. You can't apply for another Otto Bremer grant for a year. So we'll see where we go with that. Our IELCE grant also funds some kind of not related to ACP, but sort of things that I thought were worth mentioning, and that's our citizenship classes, and then our driver's education classes that we've held here on campus and at ABE. Those things are critical things that students seem to need to move forward. Coming up out of ESL and moving up into IET, driver's license is critical for getting around, sometimes for careers that they're pursuing, and getting their citizenship has been a really big piece of our IELCE grant, and so people can move forward. So those are just some of the funding sources that we've used in Mankato. And you know, I'm always looking for possibilities, but I typically do not write all these grants myself. I have written many grants, but I like to work with other agencies on every grant that we write so that we're developing the capacity of all of our partnerships to offer, you know, everything that we can. And we work really closely with our regional partners as well. And I think that's really important because the other ABE consortia around us also need to have capacity built so that they can help their students. And that in turn helps all of our pathways across the region. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. There's one question. It just says, how can you do this work without grants? Any ideas on that?
Well, if I was to answer that, I would say I don't think I'd be able to do that work without grants. For me, I don't see the career pathway, and I've talked to our workforce council executive director, Diane Halverson, about this many times. I don't see our ACP programming being sustainable by itself. I don't see us getting enough contact hours to make it sustainable. You know, we've tried over the last 12, 15 years to make it sustainable, and we haven't been able to do it. One of the big pieces is the navigator. That's not sustainable. But also the ABE programming. You know, we have a funding source for student tuition. That doesn't seem to be an issue because they can enroll in the WIOA Adult, WIOA Youth, but we don't have enough state funds to have ESL and GED and all of these career pathways. Adult career pathways takes a lot more time. It's more staff intensive because the support that's necessary is intensive to get somebody up and out of ABE and into career pathways is different. They're in what we've experienced is more diversity in what they're choosing. And so you're having to have staff meet with different study groups and really get almost one-on-one with a lot of students. And the support that they need to get through is intensive training. So I don't see it as being sustainable, and I've kind of given up on that idea that it would be. I'm just looking for ways to be braiding funding every year, and it seems like it's pretty easily come together. I haven't had problems getting funding. I don't even want to say that out loud because I feel like I'll jinx myself, but we haven't had problems getting the funding for the last dozen years.
So Karen, this is Julie. I have a
Mhm.
question in regards to that. So the fast track model, the idea behind it was adult basic education is already funded through the state and the federal government. And then the idea was to have them apply for the Pell Grant, which would leverage financial aid. And what we found out is that people need support just with families, transportation, and childcare. And that's when the WIOA partners would come in and provide that. So, and then navigation, it's that glue that kind of pulls it all together, is difficult to find funding for. That's the one piece there really isn't a targeted pot of money for. So besides that, what are the other issues? You're saying it's not sustainable, but if you, for instance, I'm just thinking of your dev ed with your contact hours, with your, that dev ed relationship, I would think that would have to be sustainable if you're offering 5 classes there. But your adult career pathway, maybe you have too few learners choosing too many different pathways. Is that what you're saying? Yep.
Yep. We have low enrollments for one. We have students choosing a lot of different areas. So for example, if we have a healthcare class, we may have 2 people going into medical term, 1 or 2 going into CNA, another one going into phlebotomy. And so that teacher is spread really thin as far as what she's doing to help those classes. She'll have 1 or 2 people she's working with in each area. The bridge class will be fine because we'll have a group in the bridge, although we haven't been getting the numbers to do that. And the same thing happens with manufacturing. We'll have a bridge and they'll divide out into some into welding, some into HVAC, some into machining. But we don't have the numbers. One of the strategies that we've tried to increase our numbers is the second point of entry, where we'll test people who come in and miss the bridge. So they're right into the integrated class, like the welding class, for example, at the college. We'll test them and see if we can enroll them at that point. We call it a second point of entry into our grant. The first point of entry would have been back in the Onramp bridge phase, but these people may have, come to the college late and never known about the bridge, or the bridge was already done. That's helped with some numbers, but also you're not just funding a teacher, you're funding a teacher who also has to have time for coordination and working with partners, attending grant meetings. The amount of time that a person needs to spend, you can't just pay a teacher wages. You have to have someone who can coordinate that work. So when I say I haven't been able to sustain it, I haven't been able to sustain the teacher/coordination piece of that. And, I was hopeful that with our Bremer grant, we would have the high numbers in developmental courses, because that's kind of seemed to me like a no-brainer for sustainability. And I wrote into the Bremer grant, once we have full cohorts going through and there's 20 to 25 people in a class, easily the contact hours will build, and we will, within 2 years, we'll be able to sustain that, which should technically have happened, except that the numbers were low in the classes and the COVID thing halted that. So we're not able to get more hours this school year, the second year of our grant. The first year was a lot of wheel spinning and not as many students getting enrolled as we wanted. So I don't see right now how I can sustain the Bremer grant after this particular 2-year period. The college is still very interested in working with us, and I think they may come up with money to continue it for another year or 2 just out of their funding. And what I mean by that, they'll pay for our ABE teachers to be in those classes. I really do think they will do that. And I may try to work on that with them and see if I can rearrange some things here with funding to help. But as far as sustainability, we really have not been able to see how to do that. Our ESL and GED program is pretty big, and we spend our state funding really on that. That's pretty much what our state funding can cover in Mankato.
So I'm going to agree with Karen on that. The contact hours that I get for state funding is basically paying for a coordinator, and the grant money I get is paying for the teacher, because you can't afford both. I mean,
Right.
you don't get enough contact hours to pay for a teacher and a coordinator, and you need a full-time coordinator to, besides a navigator, to make the program successful.
There's a lot of coordination with ACPs just because of the partnerships. Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the roles that a coordinator would do that a navigator doesn't do?
For us, that would be Ron. So Ron works with the staff involved in the ACP, runs PLCs, professional development, meets with admissions, works with the dean, works with the teachers, coordinates the students coming in, intakes of all the students. We have a multiple step intake process. Yeah. And the deed navigator is there at some of the intake points and then works with students individually throughout as they need support. But the deed navigator doesn't do the coordinating of everything.
And you have to understand, the intake process is takes much longer. Like, first of all, the students are like, oh, I just want to be a CNA, and then they're like, okay, so you get them enrolled in that, and then the next time they meet with the coordinator, the intake person, they've learned something more, and it takes twice as much time then to go through and talk to them about it and create a schedule and whatever. Now they have more barriers that then you need to transfer them over to the navigator to deal with the barriers, and it's very intensive.
Mm-hmm.
So do either of you have an adult career pathway that is offered completely online? And would your numbers increase if you could offer it regionally?
Our pathways right now are not completely online because they're welding and CNA and phlebotomy and things that require attendance. We do the bridge online. Right now, we've converted our bridges to be online, and we've converted our on-ramp to be online. Ooh, 2-minute warning, okay. But we don't, when they get to the point of the actual training at the college, most of those programs are required to have attendance because they are welding in the welding lab and doing the skills part, or they're kind of a hybrid.
So actually, our administrative office professional, our bridge part is online, and I think all the classes at our community college are online. So that would be a possibility.
Okay, any other questions? It looks like we're about out of time. Thank you, Karen, Julie, and Nadine, and thank you for listening. And you guys have a good rest of the day.
Thanks.
All righty. Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, presenters. And Patsy has just chatted out a link to a participant folder where we'll put all the information from the various sessions of the ACP Institute. And I'm just chatting out to you now, just as a reminder, this is a link for our 12:15 session. It'll start promptly at 12:15, strategies for delivering effective ACPs at a distance. And our presenters are Cindy Secord and Danielle Lang. So we're having a lunch break now until 12:15. We'll see you back at 12:15 for strategies for delivering effective ACPs at a distance. Thanks, everyone.